Welcome in, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I actually want to start right off the bat today by extending a heartfelt divine blessing for your day and really for your entire week ahead.
Yes, absolutely. We're really thrilled to have you here with us for this deep dive.
We are, because today we are jumping headfirst into Matthew chapter 10. And to guide our analysis, we're pulling insights directly from two incredibly detailed sources, the Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible.
Right. And if you are, looking at how to launch a movement in a totally hostile environment, this chapter is incredible.
It really is. It's essentially Jesus's ultimate mission manual for his 12 apostles. It's demanding, it's granular, and it fundamentally upends conventional strategy. Okay, let's unpack this. We have Jesus calling these 12 men, transitioning them from disciples.
Which the notes point out simply means learners.
Exactly, transitioning them from learners to apostles, meaning sent ones. But the geographical boundaries of this first mission are incredibly strict.
They really are, and that's a crucial starting point. Jesus initiates this as a highly specific short-term deployment. He gives the 12 authority, but then he draws a hard line. He says, do not go on the roads of the Gentiles and do not enter any Samaritan cities.
Instead, they're told to go exclusively to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Right. And the Study Bible spends significant time unpacking the theology behind this because, on the surface, it appears highly restrictive.
Yeah, almost exclusive.
Yeah, but the Holman notes clarify the underlying biblical theology here. The redemptive narrative was structurally designed to flow through national Israel first, to fulfill the Abrahamic covenants.
So it wasn't an exclusion of the rest of the world.
No, not at all. It was a sequencing strategy. The gospel had to take root within the Jewish context first before it could systematically expand outward to the Gentiles and Samaritans in the later phases of the early church.
That sequential strategy makes sense structurally.
Whoa.
But when we look at the actual personnel executing phase one, the logic gets a lot harder to follow.
Oh, definitely.
Looking at the roster provided in the text, Peter is listed first, acting functionally as the spokesman. And Judas Iscariot is always listed last. We know how that ends.
Yeah.
But the tension in the middle of this group is what really jumps out. You wouldn't put this team together if you wanted a cohesive, unified front.
What's fascinating here is how the commentaries highlight the extreme, almost volatile political and social diversity of these 12 men.
Right.
It is so easy for us to just read a list of ancient names and ignore the heavy cultural baggage attached to them. The NAA study notes bring this into sharp focus by contrasting two specific disciples, Matthew and Simon the Zealot.
The tax collector and the revolutionary.
Exactly. The sources point out that Matthew, as a tax collector, was essentially a financial contractor for the Roman Empire. In that socio-political framework, he was extracting wealth from his own people to fund a foreign occupying power.
He was a collaborator.
A total collaborator. Tax collectors were culturally and religiously despised as extortionists.
Right, and the Holman notes point out that sitting in the exact same group is Simon the Zealot. And we really have to be clear about what that term meant historically.
It wasn't just about being enthusiastic.
No, not at all. The sources explain that the Zealots operated as a militant anti-Roman faction. Their core ideology was that submitting to Roman taxation was tantamount to treason against God.
Wow.
Yeah, many were actively engaged in violent insurrection to dismantle the Roman occupation. So Jesus deliberately recruits a man who is actively collaborating with Rome and a man whose entire political existence is dedicated to destroying Rome.
And the study Bibles suggest this wasn't accidental diversity. It was a calculated move to demonstrate that allegiance to the kingdom of heaven supersedes even the most explosive political divides of the ancient world.
That is such a powerful point.
It is. The mission demanded an allegiance that completely neutralized their prior earthly affiliations. And that socioeconomic diversity extends to Judas Iscariot as well. Well, the linguistic notes indicate that his surname, Iscariot, likely translates to man of Kerioth, which references a specific town in Judea.
Okay.
Why does that matter? Because it strongly implies Judas was the only non-Galilean in a group of Galileans. He was geographically and culturally an outsider to the rest of the core group.
But despite that outsider status, the text notes he was entrusted with the group's finances. He held the money bag.
Right.
Which creates a profound tension when you consider the packing instructions Jesus gives them next, because Judas might be holding the money bag, but Jesus tells them not to put anything in it.
Zero funds.
Yeah, the travel logistics here are radically minimalist. According to the text, Jesus commands them not to acquire gold, silver, or even copper coins for their belts.
Nothing.
They're forbidden from taking a travel bag, extra tunics, sandals, or even a walking stick. In any logistical framework, sending a team out with zero resources or defensive equipment seems incredibly reckless.
It absolutely simulates extreme vulnerability. But the study notes provide the necessary spiritual context here. This wasn't a lesson in asceticism or just traveling light for speed.
Right.
By systematically stripping away every conceivable layer of financial and material security, Jesus was forcing the apostles into absolute daily dependence on God's provision.
Like the wilderness.
Exactly like that. The commentaries draw a direct theological parallel here to the Israelites relying entirely on manna in the Old Testament. Furthermore, Jesus grounds this in a specific principle. The worker is worthy of his food.
The strategic expectation was that the communities receiving the spiritual ministry would, in turn, provide for the physical needs of the messengers. It established a symbiotic reliance.
But the text doesn't assume every community is going to warmly receive them.
No, it doesn't. Jesus establishes a very specific protocol for rejection, and the NAA Study Bible's analysis of this is fascinating. Jesus tells the disciples that if a household or town refuses their message, they are to shake the dust off your feet as they leave.
Which sounds kind of petty today.
Right, to a modern reader, that just sounds like a dramatic expression of frustration. But the historical context shows this was a massive, calculated theological insult.
Yes.
The notes explain that devout Jews of that era had a strict tradition. When they re-entered the Holy Land after traveling through Gentile or pagan territories, they would literally shake the dust off their feet to avoid tracking pagan impurity into sacred space.
Precisely. It was a physical demarcation of holy versus profane. So when Jesus commands Jewish apostles to perform this exact same ritual against Jewish towns that reject the gospel, the implications are staggering.
They're making a huge statement.
There really are. They are effectively declaring to those communities, by rejecting the Messiah, you have placed yourselves outside the covenant. You are now indistinguishable from pagans.
It's a severe prophetic indictment. And Jesus follows it with a chilling postscript, stating it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town.
The commentaries note that using Sodom as the baseline for divine wrath really underscores the absolute gravity of rejecting this specific mission.
And the severity of that warning transitions perfectly into the operational realities Jesus outlines next. He uses a striking metaphor, telling them, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves.
Such a vivid image.
He follows that by commanding them to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. The Holman study notes break down this dual animal imagery beautifully. The serpent aspect represents prudence, shrewdness, and tactical awareness.
Avoiding traps.
Exactly. Jesus is demanding that they have the situational awareness to recognize traps and strategically avoid unnecessary danger. They aren't called to be naive martyrs. They're supposed to navigate the hostility with deep tactical intelligence.
But that tactical intelligence has a strict boundary, which is where the dove comes in. The dove symbolizes purity of intention, simplicity, and a strict adherence to nonviolence.
So they can't act like the wolves.
Exactly. The notes emphasize that while the apostles must understand the deceptive tactics of the wolves around them, they are categorically forbidden from adopting those tactics. They must remain uncompromised messengers of peace.
Even though the wolves will be vicious.
Very. Jesus is brutally honest about the specific shapes those wolves will take. He outlines a precise trajectory of persecution. They'll be handed over to local religious councils, they will face physical flogging in the synagogues, and they will eventually be dragged before secular Gentile authorities like governors and kings.
But he anchors that terrifying prediction with a remarkable promise. He tells them that when they are arrested, they shouldn't calculate their defense because the Spirit of the Father will speak directly through them.
Which is incredibly comforting.
It is a promise of divine eloquence in the moment of highest worldly pressure. But right after this comforting promise, we hit a verse that has generated massive theological debate. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yes. Verse 23.
In Matthew 10:23, Jesus says, "You will not finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes." Now, the audience knows the Son of Man is a heavy apocalyptic title drawn from the book of Daniel, denoting divine authority and judgment.
Right.
But the apostles obviously finished their Galilean tour, and Jesus didn't descend in apocalyptic glory right then.
Yes, this verse is a major interpretive crux. The study notes from both the NAA and Holman Bible synthesize the four dominant historical and theological interpretations to make sense of what Jesus meant by this coming.
Let's walk through them.
Sure. Theory 1 suggests this refers specifically to Jesus' resurrection. The theological argument here is that the initial mission to Israel would continue until the resurrection powerfully vindicated him as the Son of Man, fundamentally shifting the nature of their message.
Okay, that makes sense.
Theory 2 points to the events of Pentecost. This view argues that the sending of the Holy Spirit was a definitive, powerful coming of Christ's presence that officially launched the broader church era.
Okay, so the resurrection and Pentecost both focus on the immediate foundational events of the early church. But the study Bibles also present Theory 3, which pushes the timeline further out to the year 70 AD.
The destruction of the temple.
Exactly. The notes explain that in biblical prophecy, God enacting severe national judgment is frequently described as Him coming in the clouds. Under this framework, the coming of the Son of Man refers to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple.
Right.
The argument is that the exclusive, concentrated mission to the cities of national Israel ended definitively when the Jewish state and its religious epicenter were physically dismantled.
Which brings us to Theory 4, which the commentaries note carries significant weight. This theory posits that Jesus is indeed referring to his ultimate second coming at the end of human history.
So he's collapsing the timeline.
Yes. He is speaking not just to the 12 men in front of him, but to the ongoing reality of the church. The implication is that the specific mission to bring the gospel to the Jewish people is not just a brief historical footnote. It is a continuous, urgent mandate that will persist right up until the final eschatological return of Christ.
What I appreciate about the study Bibles laying out those four distinct frameworks is that regardless of whether you lean towards 70 AD or the Second Coming, the functional takeaway for the apostles is identical. Absolute urgency.
Yes.
And that urgency requires them to fundamentally conquer their fear. Jesus tells them explicitly not to fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Instead, they are to fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. On its face, that sounds like a command to just swap one terror for a larger terror.
It does, but the linguistic analysis in the Holman notes completely reframes that assumption. The Greek word used here for fear is phobio.
Like phobia.
Exactly. It's the root of our word phobia. But the notes explain that in the biblical lexicon, phobio covers a massive spectrum. On the negative end, it means literal terror, panic, and the dread of physical harm, what the text calls the fear of man.
Right.
But on the positive end, when directed toward God, phobia signifies a profound reverential awe. It is the deep comprehension of God's absolute sovereignty and his authority over eternal destinies.
So it's not about being terrified of God.
No. Jesus is telling the apostles to eradicate the paralyzing panic of earthly persecutors by cultivating a liberating reverential awe of the only one who actually holds ultimate reality.
And to ensure that this reverential awe doesn't devolve into viewing God as a distant, unfeeling judge, Jesus immediately pivots to the imagery of the sparrows.
Such a beautiful shift.
He notes that 2 sparrows are sold for a single penny. The study Bibles provide great context here. The coin mentioned is the Assyrian, a Roman copper coin of practically zero value. Sparrows were the absolute cheapest commodity in the ancient meat market.
Virtually worthless.
Yet, Jesus declares that not a single one of these birds falls to the ground apart from the Father's sovereign consent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the theological argument Jesus is constructing is impenetrable. He moves from the sparrows to telling the disciples that the very hairs on their heads are all numbered by God.
Wow.
The commentaries emphasize the sheer intimacy of that statement. The Creator possesses an exhaustive, detailed knowledge of their lives that they themselves don't even possess.
Which gives them immense value.
Exactly. Therefore, Jesus concludes, "Do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows." It is an argument from the lesser to the greater. If God's meticulous, sustaining providence covers the cheapest market commodity, the apostles must recognize their own immeasurable, eternal value to the Father.
When that reality is internalized, the fear of temporary physical persecution loses its grip.
It really does.
That is deeply anchoring. But just as the apostles are likely absorbing that comfort, Jesus shatters expectations again. He announces, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword."
Yeah, that's jarring.
He explicitly states this will cause a man to be set against his father and a daughter against her mother. For an audience steeped in the prophetic promises of the Messiah bringing ultimate peace, this is an almost contradictory declaration.
It is arguably one of the most difficult sayings in the gospel, and the study notes are careful to clarify the metaphor. Jesus is absolutely not endorsing armed conflict or physical violence.
Right. The sword isn't a literal weapon.
Correct. The sword here is a symbol for sharp, inevitable ideological and spiritual division. The commentaries emphasize that in the first century Mediterranean world, the family unit was the absolute center of existence.
It dictated everything.
Everything. Your economy, your social standing, and your religious identity. By demanding a loyalty that supersedes those deep familial bonds, Jesus is forcing a crisis of allegiance. When an individual embraces Christ and their family vehemently rejects him, a painful separation, a metaphorical sword, is driven right through the household.
The sources make it clear that Jesus is demanding total supremacy over every earthly affection, and he drives that point home with an even more visceral image. He says that whoever does not take up their cross and follow him is not worthy of him.
And we really have to look at the history there.
Yes. Because of 2,000 years of religious iconography, we often soften that phrase to mean enduring a daily annoyance, like a bad commute. But the NAA study notes highlight the brutal historical weight of this command. You have to remember the chronology. Jesus is saying this to first-century Jews before he's been crucified.
This raises an important question. What does true allegiance actually cost? To the apostles standing there, the cross wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was the Roman Empire's instrument of ultimate state terror.
It was reserved for the worst of the worst.
Slaves, insurrectionists, and the lowest strata of society. The notes explain that when a condemned man was forced to carry the crossbeam through the city, it signaled that he was already dead to the world. He had been stripped of all rights, all autonomy, and all future ambitions.
So he's telling them to die to themselves.
By invoking the cross, Jesus is telling them that true discipleship requires the absolute execution of the ego. It is a demand to entirely abandon self-preservation and surrender completely to the will of God, no matter the worldly humiliation involved.
Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The paradox of the gospel is laid bare right there.
Beautifully said.
But the chapter doesn't conclude in the ashes of self-denial. It actually culminates in a beautiful vision of shared reward.
Oh.
Jesus shifts the focus from the apostles facing the persecution to the people who will receive them. Yes, he says that anyone who receives a disciple actually receives Jesus himself, and by extension the Father. It validates these dusty, impoverished messengers as literal emissaries of the divine.
It creates a powerful theology of partnership. The commentaries point out a specific progression in Jesus' words here. He says whoever receives a prophet gets a prophet's reward, and whoever receives a righteous person gets a righteous person's reward.
And then he goes even smaller.
He distills it down to the most microscopic, ordinary level of hospitality. He declares that whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones will certainly not lose their eternal reward.
And these little ones.
The study notes clarify that these little ones is not a reference to children. It is a term of identification for the vulnerable, traveling missionaries themselves.
Which means that God's accounting system for kingdom work is incredibly granular. A cup of cold water is the absolute baseline of ancient hospitality, yet it carries eternal weight when it is offered in recognition of the mission.
Exactly. The sources note that this validates the entire ecosystem of the mission. The traveling apostles enduring the severe hardships are necessary, but the people who quietly shelter them, fund them, and offer them a cup of water are participating in the exact same eternal enterprise.
God misses none of it.
None of it.
So what does this all mean? When we synthesize the notes from the Holman and NAA Study Bibles, Matthew 10 reveals itself as a brilliant, unvarnished blueprint for kingdom expansion. Jesus demands the impossible, surrendering all financial security, enduring severe physical and social persecution, and prioritizing him above your own family and very life.
But look at the promises.
Exactly. He couples those severe demands with profound, intimate guarantees. The Spirit will provide the words, the Father numbers the hairs on your head, and even the smallest gesture of support echoes into eternity.
It is the definitive intersection of stark, worldly realism and unbreakable divine assurance. It forces anyone studying it to aggressively evaluate where their ultimate security actually lies.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought to chew on this week. We spent a lot of time analyzing the radical demands placed on the apostles to leave everything behind and travel into hostility. But think about the people Jesus mentions at the very end, the ones providing the cup of cold water.
The support system.
Yes. If you were packing for a vital life mission today, one that required your absolute focus and loyalty, what essential things, habits, or even relationships would you have to leave behind in order to truly rely on your calling? Just like the apostles had to leave their extra tunics and walking sticks.
That's a challenging question. Are you the traveler stepping out with nothing? Or the courageous host leveraging everything you have for the mission?
It really makes you think. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. Remember that God blesses all the listeners. We will see you next time.